All right, today we're diving into a paper that tackles a really interesting question. It's titled, Are Less Hierarchical Firms Organized Around Stronger Cultures? This is a scholarly deconstruction of the work by Ariana Marchetti and Puranam, forthcoming in the Strategic Management Journal. So let's start with the central puzzle. We've all heard the stories about these so-called flat companies, places like Zappos or Valve, where traditional managers are few and far between. The big idea is that if you have a really strong shared culture, you don't need all those bosses. But is that actually true? Or is it just a cool story that only works for a handful of famous companies? This paper uses data to get past the anecdotes and find a real answer. At its core, this is about two different ways to get organized. On one hand, you have the classic managerial hierarchy. This is all about control through rules, monitoring, and having supervisors tell people what to do. On the other hand, you have strong culture. Here, control comes from shared beliefs and values. Everyone just kind of knows the right way to act. The question is, how do these two things relate? So here's our roadmap. We'll start by digging into the flat organization puzzle itself. Then we'll look at the incredible data sets the researchers used to tackle it. After that, we'll get to the main event, what the evidence actually says. And finally, we'll talk about what it all means, these two different paths to the same goal. Okay, first up, the flat organization puzzle. Let's really frame the core question here. How do these firms with very few managers actually function day to day? To answer that, we need this key concept, integration of effort. It sounds academic, but it's really simple. It's the fundamental goal of any organization. It just means getting everyone to cooperate and coordinate effectively, to pull in the same direction. Every company has to solve this problem one way or another. The paper lays out two competing theories to explain the relationship between hierarchy and culture. Think of them as two different suspects in our investigation. The first is called the functional equivalence theory, and the second is the fragmentation theory. So theory number one, functional equivalence. This idea suggests that hierarchy and culture are basically just two different tools for the same job. They're two distinct paths you can take to achieve that integration of effort. If you rely heavily on one, you probably don't need as much of the other. They're substitutes. Now, for theory number two, fragmentation. This one's a little different. It argues that a heavy managerial hierarchy doesn't just substitute for culture, it actively harms it. The idea is that having too many layers of management breaks the organization into these little silos, these separate groups, which makes it really hard to maintain a single, unified culture. So we have these two competing explanations. To figure out which one is right, the researchers needed data. And they didn't just use a little bit of data. They used massive, and I mean massive data sets. First, to measure culture. How do you do that at scale? Well, they analyzed the text of 1.5 million employee reviews from Glassdoor. They used machine learning to understand the consensus and focus of what people were saying about their company's cultures. And what about hierarchy? For that, they turned to professional social media profiles. They crunched the data from 42 million profiles to figure out the ratio of managers to non-managers inside each company. In the end, their final sample included nearly 23,000 U.S. firms. So this isn't just looking at a few tech darlings. This is a broad, systematic investigation across the economy. Let's be precise about what they were measuring. Managerial intensity is pretty straightforward. It's the proportion of managers to total employees. Cultural strength is more sophisticated. It's not just about what values a company has, but about the level of consensus among employees on those values, and how intensely they focus on just a few core attributes. All right, we've set the stage, we've seen the data. Now for the main event. What did the evidence actually say? The first and maybe biggest finding is this. There is a robust negative association. In other words, firms with more managers, what they call higher managerial intensity, systematically tend to have weaker cultures. The data was really clear on this point. But the crucial question is why? Is it functional equivalence or fragmentation? Well, the researchers tested this. The functional equivalence theory predicted that this negative relationship would hold true even in companies that were otherwise very similar in their success. And the data supported that. On the other hand, the fragmentation theory predicted that the negative effect of managers on culture would get weaker over time. The data did not support that prediction. So the verdict is in. The evidence points pretty strongly to functional equivalence being the real driving mechanism here. It's not that managers are necessarily bad for culture.
It's that they are one of two alternative ways to achieve coordination.
So, what does this all mean for how we think about organizing our companies? This brings us to our final section: two paths, one goal. If you boil it all down, the core message is this: a strong culture and a manager-heavy hierarchy are simply different paths you can take to get to the exact same goal, which is having an organized, effective company. So let's spell out the key takeaways. First, hierarchy and culture can be substitutes or functional equivalents. This means that if you want to flatten your organization by reducing managers, you almost certainly need to invest in strengthening your culture to make up for it. And really importantly, the best choice depends on your context, your industry, your goals. There's no single best way to do this. It's a fundamental strategic choice. And that leaves us with a final, really practical question to think about for our own organizations. Looking at your own team, at your own company, is your culture actually strong enough to ditch the hierarchy? Something to think about.